My name is Sean from IK Academy, and I'm delighted to be your host today. I warmly welcome all of you to all this Learn with IK Live series webinar entitled Rolling Bearing Technology, New Age Mounting, Dismounting, and Condition Monitoring. For your information, this webinar is organized by iClub by IK, which is our IK Academy community page on Facebook. And for your information, this webinar will also be streaming on our Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube pages. So what we hope to do in iClub is to nurture and create a community of like-minded engineers. So please go ahead and join our community page by visiting it and then clicking on the join button. We'd also be really happy if you could invite anyone else that you can think of who could benefit from joining our community. Now, as a friendly reminder, please remember to register yourselves through Eventbrite to make sure that you won't miss any future notifications for our upcoming events. It's also important for us to keep a record of your attendance. Now, if you have any questions about our community, about iClub, or any of our social media pages, the IK crew are standing by to attend to your questions. And don't forget to type hashtag IK Academy, one word, into the comment sections of any of our social media portals. So I'd like to briefly touch on what we do here at IK. We are a technical training provider, and we have the purpose of transforming engineers into greatness. Our ultimate goal is to build and inspire greater engineers for the world, integrating knowledge as a force for good. Engineers are inventors, designers, and builders of the modern age. Engineers build the world. Hence, we believe that greater engineers means a greater world. Also, neutrality is our top priority. We are totally brand neutral with a strict focus on education, and our training programs cover power, maintenance, the environment, building facilities, project management, and more. And we are committed to provide the best learning experience for everyone. Please like and share this live webinar with those who you think will be interested with today's topic. You may also click on the share button and share it directly to your social media page, or share the link on WhatsApp, Telegram, and so on. So before I invite and introduce our guest speaker for today, could everyone here please type hashtag IK Academy, remember that's IK Academy in one word, in the comment section to show your support and attendance. That would be very much appreciated. So today's webinar topic is rolling bearing technology. And our invited speaker is Mr. Henry Cheng, who will be sharing his knowledge and experience with all of us today. But before I bring him onto the stage, I'd like to briefly introduce him to all of you. In 2009, Henry joined Scheffler as a field service engineer. He was responsible for providing technical advice and expertise concerning bearing and service products to MRO customers in their production facilities. He's also been promoting and supporting sales products of bearing products to the MRO customer side since that time. And in 2012, he joined another bearing multinational company before eventually rejoining Scheffler in 2016. Since then, he is mainly responsible for technical support on a variety of services covering bearing mounting, dismounting services, lubrication, online and offline monitoring, supporting sales engineers by providing technical proposals, root cause analysis, training, troubleshooting, and technical advice. So he's definitely run the gamut of all these operational duties. Now, Mr. Henry is now the engineering manager for Schaeffler Bearings, Malaysia, Sendirian Berhad. We're very excited to have Mr. Henry Cheng join us here today. And so, Mr. Henry, please go ahead and turn on your camera and unmute your mic.
All right. Can you see me, John?
Yes, I can see you and hear you loud and clear. Mr. Henry, how are you doing today?
Very well today. The weather seems good, so I think it's a good day for us to start off this webinar. I think many of us are keen to hear what we have to present today as well.
Very good. All right. So to everyone here, please say hello to Mr. Henry Cheng by typing a quick hi in the comment section. And also don't forget the hashtag. Now, if you have any questions during the webinar for Mr. Henry, feel free to type your questions in the comment sections, and the IK crew will gather all of them and pass them to me. And then when Mr. Henry is done presenting his topic, then we will move to the Q&A session. So now, without further ado, Mr. Henry, I'd like to pass the stage to you for your presentation.
All right, thank you very much, Sean. Okay, just a very quick technical check. Are you able to see my screen, Sean?
Yes, the screen is working. The slides are working fine.
All right, awesome. Okay, let's go ahead then. All right, very good day to everybody. My name is Henry. I think Sean did a very good introduction as well. So first and foremost, we would like to thank IK Academy for hosting this for us as well. Okay, so for today's topic, we'll be talking about rolling bearing technology. So what is a bearing? Where is it being used? What type of bearing? And there will be a technical drawing, which we will actually guide you on how you want to look at this particular information. Other than that, we're going to touch a bit on some new age mounting and dismounting tools, that is actually really high tech and saves time, speeds up things, and so on. And last but not least, on condition monitoring, on how data can help you to analyze and also to plan your shutdown accordingly. All right, so let me just quickly, briefly talk about Scheffler. Well, Scheffler is a German company, right? So we are bearing manufacturer. We are actually the leading global supplier for not only for industrial, but also automotive sectors as well. So again, we have more than about 74 years of experience in bearings, in condition monitoring, and even for plant manufacturing as well, because we actually made our own bearings. And for Industry 4.0, we actually sell what we use. We actually have our systems installed in our plants as well. So this is a milestone for Scheffler. As you can see, it all started since 1946, right? And up to now, we are actually very strong. We have more than 10,000 different products available for the various kind of application or even challenging application as well. So the sectors that we are covering, of course, automotive aftermarket, and industry. But today's focus will be talking more on the industry related sectors. All right, so what do we have? We have bearings from 1 mm diameter, all right, up to about 4,250 mm diameter. And these are the various range that we actually carry. Of course, there's more than that, but this is the main parts that we actually manufacture and we supply to our end users. So it covers all type of bearings, ball bearings, right? Engine bearings, needle rollers, plain bearing. So as you can see, there are so many types of bearings which we'll talk about later today. And also what will be the common application that actually uses this. So there are bearings that are standard bearings, and there are even bearings that are made specially for specific application. So what's interesting over here as well, we'll be covering also on the condition monitoring system and how do we use this vibration data to determine on the performance of the bearing. So let's start off with the rolling bearing technology. All right. So first and foremost, for those who do not know what bearing is, all right. So bearings is actually very critical, but often an overlooked element, right? So the purpose of bearings is mainly this. These are the functions. It separates two objects in a relative motion. It reduces friction between these objects. Of course, the purpose of the bearing is mainly also to transfer load from one object to another and locate one object relative to another, reduces heat and wear, because whenever there's rotation, there will be friction, right? And therefore, with a rolling bearing, is able to reduce heat and wear. And last but not least, with the right bearing, with the right lubrication, this is where we are able to reduce vibration and even noise as well. So here's one example. As you can see, there's a motor here, and there are two bearings here. So these two bearings are the one that is supporting the shaft, and it is connected to the housing and of course to the motor body as well. So whatever this motor is connected to, and that particular connection will also have bearings. So whenever the shaft rotates, this is the bearing that will be supporting the rotation and of course supporting on the load of the particular application. All right, so a very brief introduction, or what I call that, a very brief information on the parts of the rolling bearing. So in every bearing, basically there are 4 elements, right? So the first one, as you can see over here, the top part here, or the position or the area that is sitting onto a housing, this is where we call it as the outer ring. Okay, and the next one, we have the inner ring. So the inner ring is the one where we actually sit the bearing onto the shaft. So what else is there? We have the rotating part, which is the rolling element. And finally, something to hold the rolling element, we call it as the cage. So this is the 4 main elements of the bearing. And when we talk about bearing envelope dimension or the main dimension, here are the 3 dimensions that we often have to clarify. So first and foremost, we have the small d here, which is the inner ring diameter. We have the outer ring diameter, and we even have the width of the bearing. So why is this important in the first place? Take an example. So if you have a machine, probably you do not have the bearing part number, or maybe the manual is not available and so on. And when you remove the bearing, most of the time the bearing part number is already covered, probably it has been rusted or worn out and etc. So there's no way to identify the particular bearing part number. So one way to solve this is mainly to measure these 3 dimensions. Okay, just remember the inner ring diameter, outer ring diameter, and the width of the bearing. So from there, you can actually contact us, or maybe you can look into a catalog based on this particular dimension or the bearing envelope dimension. But is this sufficient? No, right? Because for the same dimension, there will be different types of bearings, which we will cover later, right? So for this particular one, if you look into the rolling element, it's actually the ball type. All right, and there's also similar dimension that actually uses different rollers. For example, like this case over here, if you see my pointer, this is a cylindrical roller type. So therefore, 4th thing you have to notify, right, or you have to be aware of is the rolling element type. So that's where we actually name our bearings. Not really ours, but in general, bearings is actually named based on their rolling element. So if you hear things like deep groove ball bearings or cylindrical roller bearings or tapered roller bearings and so on, it is mainly based on their rolling element. All right. So this is one way how we identify the bearing accordingly. But of course, there's more to that. It's not only the type of bearing, but there is certain criteria as well. For example, the clearance, the tolerances, whether if the bearing is sealed or it's an open bearing. So all of these are very important information, if you wish to do a replacement or whenever, if you do not have this particular part number available. So always feel free to contact us. We'll be glad, to really help you out on this as well, to make sure that you have the right bearings installed in your machine in order to avoid any failures and so on. All right, so if we look into this, when we talk about ball bearings, there's already 5 types of ball bearings over here, right? So of course, it's a very common that we see this type of deep groove ball bearings. It's used mainly everywhere, right? If you see your bicycle, maybe perhaps you try to open up and so on, you will basically see this type of ball bearings. Of course, in the fans, in your ceiling fan and etc. But these are all the common type, right? But in the industrial type, of course, there's different type of application. And if you look into the legend over here, so if you see this FR, basically it means that it is the radial load carrying capacity. So this particular bearing, what is the capability of handling radial load? Radial load means that it is the weight from the top. And also there's axial load as well. So bearings, no matter how, they will encounter 2 types of load, the radial load and the axial load as well. The axial load basically comes from the side over here. So whether it's one side or both sides, that depends on the particular bearing. Moment load, compensation for misalignment, right? Some applications, perhaps you have a long shaft or etc. Or maybe if you need to have an application that allows certain misalignment, then yes, you probably need to select a particular bearing that is able to carry this misalignment. What else? Speed suitability. Speed basically means that over here, what is the maximum speed allowable for this particular bearing? All right. So these are all the main criteria when it comes to selection of the bearing. But of course, if your particular bearing uses maybe a deep groove ball bearing, then it is highly recommended that you basically use back the deep groove ball bearing. Okay, but if there are always failure happening with that particular deep groove ball bearing, then perhaps something is wrong, and this is where we actually come in to support you in order to select or perhaps to modify a little bit on using a different type of bearing that is suitable for your application. So over here you see the highlight over here. So if it's max means that it is extremely suitable and so on. So if you look into a deep groove ball bearing, radial load is fairly okay, it's more than half. Axial load, no problem, you can carry it in two positions, right? So it's both sides. So whether the load comes from here or comes from here, there's no issue. It's able to take axial load in both directions. Misalignment is really, really low. You know, this kind of deep groove ball bearings are not designed to take misalignment. And of course, if you see the speed capability is very high. So that means that the deep groove ball bearings, or maybe perhaps I put it in general, a radial ball bearing is able to take fairly high radial load, right? And also high speed as well. But there are some applications that perhaps need higher load and so on. So this is where we come to the next slide later on the radial roller bearings. So what happens if you need misalignment, right? Or we need something that perhaps carry only one side load and so on. So this is where this type of bearing comes in. We call it the angular contact ball bearing. So the angular contact ball bearing, if you notice, the contact point for ball bearing is basically on the top. And for angular contact is actually on the side. And because of this, if you notice that the axial load for both directions is not possible. So the load can only comes from this direction here because the contact point of the ball and the raceway is at an angle. So just try to imagine if you have a load coming from the opposite direction, which is here, then a separation will happen, and this is where failure will happen. So it's very important sometimes that when you have an e-motor or any particular machine that uses this angular contact ball bearing, please ensure that, you know, if you have a technical drawing ready, to make sure that you mount this particular bearing properly. We have an experience with one of the customers, which this particular bearing was installed in the opposite direction. And because of this load carrying capacity and the opposite load that's coming in, failure basically happens only in 1 hour of operation. All right, so please be aware of this kind of bearings. All right, and if you need something that basically needs to carry certain misalignment, so if you notice, this is the self-aligning ball bearing. The self-aligning ball bearing is interesting because it's able to swivel in and out. Of course, there's a certain degree of angle that the misalignment can carry, right? More often it's about 1.5 to perhaps 2 degrees as well. All right, but because of this, right, there's two rolling elements over here. So therefore, if you see, the axial load is actually relatively low compared to the angular contact or even the deep groove ball bearing. All right, and of course, there's other applications that needed different type of bearings. For example, this is an angular contact ball bearing type, which is a double row. It is made in a double row. You will see this very often somehow in your wheel bearing. If you open up your wheel bearing, you'll be seeing this type of angular contact ball bearing that is a double row. What else? Okay, so this is very interesting bearing. So we noticed that all of these bearings are able to carry radial loads fairly good, right? But there are some application that only carries axial load, you know, or they call it as a truss bearing. So this kind of truss bearing is designed where we have this 4-point contact ball bearing. If you notice here, the radial load is very rare and the axial load is relatively high. And of course, you'll be able to handle both directions. So commonly, this bearing is paired together with another bearing that carries heavy radial load. So let's go into the roller bearing type. So same thing as well. So we do not have, there's no one perfect bearing for all application. If you see here, this is a cylindrical roller bearing. Look at the radial load maximum, no problem with that. And because it's using a roller type of bearing, therefore we have to sacrifice a little bit on the running speed over here, which is the limiting speed. And because this particular bearing is separable, it's not able to carry an axial load. So therefore, normally a combination is required for a particular application. All right. And then we have this tapered roller bearing. If you notice, the rolling elements are basically tapered. This guy can actually handle very high radial and axial load as well. And of course, because if it's a roller type bearing, therefore we have to sacrifice a little bit on the speed. But again, if you look in general, right, any heavy duty application normally doesn't run at high speed. So therefore, it is able, now these kind of bearings are really suitable for high load application, but of course, it doesn't run at high speed. So high speed is actually not needed for such application. And if you notice, the misalignment are all very low, and some is even not possible. So one of the most common bearing in the industry, being it the industrial fan and so on, basically it uses the spherical roller bearing. I think this is one of the highly used bearing in the sectors as well. So the spherical roller bearing is very good in terms of radial load, carrying capacity, able to handle axial in both direction, and the best part here that is able to handle misalignment. So it's a very interesting bearing. Of course, this is one of the highly used bearing also. All right, so whenever you request for technical drawing, right, for a particular bearing, so you'll be able to see such drawings. So the drawing will actually tell you what is the envelope dimension, number one. This is the inner ring bore. You have the outer ring bore and also the width as well. Anything other than that, this is the tolerances. If you see here, all bearings has its own tolerances, right? And mainly we follow all the standards based on the ISO as well. So these standards are important because if you get genuine bearing, these tolerances are strictly followed. And that's the risk, if you happen to get a counterfeit bearing. So normally, you will not get such tight tolerances for your bearing, and if you install it, definitely failure will happen. All right, so this is the three different type of bearings. If you notice, right, all these three has the same envelope dimension, right? So we have the same inner ring bore, we have the same outer ring diameter, we have the same width as well. So this is the reason why the type of rolling elements is really important in order to identify certain type of bearings. So over here, we have a deep groove ball bearing, normally starts with 6. We have the cylindrical roller bearings. This is a NU bearing. And we have the spherical roller bearing, which normally starts with 2. All right. So these are all the part numbering that is very important. I mean, if you order back certain type of bearings, please follow back the particular part number. If there is a suffix like a C3 or a C4, that refers to the clearance, and that is fairly important as well. Please follow back the particular OEM bearing that was installed in your application. All right. So the next thing we look at is the load ratings. So the load ratings over here specify what is the carrying capacity of the particular bearing. The CR is the dynamic load rating. The COR is the static load rating. So that means that this particular bearing is able to handle 177 kilonewton, right? And it is able to run 1 million revolution until fatigue starts to happen on the raceway. So now we are looking at the same bearing, the same dimension, right? But if you notice, hey, this is my load rating, it's actually way lower for ball bearing compared to a roller type. So the cylindrical roller is up to 450, the spherical is up to about 495. So that's one of the reasons why, right? When it comes to selection of the bearings, the load is very important so that we can select the proper bearing accordingly. So what's next? We have the limiting speed. So this limiting speed for this particular bearing is 1940 RPM. And the cylindrical roller bearing and spherical roller bearing is going up to about 3,000 and 4,000. But Henry, you just mentioned that, hey, the ball bearing is able to is able to go higher speed, right? Why is it like that? So yes, if this is an open bearing, right? So if you see this picture, this is an open bearing, then yes, it's able to achieve higher speed compared to the roller type. But why is it this particular bearing is lower? So if we notice, based on the drawing, there's a seal over here, right? There's a rubber seal over here, and it is normally specified in the particular bearing suffix as well. If you see there's a 2RSR or 2RS, that means that there's a seal. Whenever when there's a seal, then the limiting speed will basically drop. So a seal is actually important in a way that it avoids any type of contamination to go into the bearing. And normally this sealed bearing already comes with certain grease that is actually grease for life. So it's able to last for life. All right. And because of the friction between the seal and the inner ring raceway, so this is where it affects the limiting speed. So whenever you need to do a change or a modification, always take note of all this information. For example, the load rating and the limiting speed. So let me give you an example. So you have a particular machine, right? It has a seal externally, and you're using a open bearing. So the particular bearing, the limiting speed, is probably up to about 5,000 RPM, but your application only runs at 900 RPM. And because often failure happens due to water, moisture, and whatever that goes into the bearing, and you would like to actually improve the particular bearing life. So this is where I can actually use this type of sealed bearings. So it gives you additional protection, but of course, since the particular bearing, your particular application runs at 900 RPM, and this bearing is able to take up to about 1,900 RPM, so there's no problem. You can actually use this particular bearing in your certain application. So just be aware of all this kind of information. These are very important information. Of course, again, if you have any doubts, please feel free to reach out to us anytime. All right. So the fifth element of bearing, this is something that everyone overlooks. Whenever a bearing fails, they will say the bearing is no good and so on. But there's always this fifth element that makes sure that the bearing life is able to achieve longer. So this is the lubrication. Be it grease or oil, lubrication is important for all rolling bearings. So why is there lubrication? It is actually required, to make sure that there's a separation between the rolling element and the raceway, the outer ring and the inner ring. So with certain thickness of lubrication, it will be able to achieve what we call that a good separation. Because if you have a very bad separation between the outer ring and the rolling elements, high metal-metal contact will happen. And of course, finally, the bearing will definitely fail. So in conclusion, whenever the lubrication breaks down or whenever the lubrication fails, this is where the bearing fails. All right. So how do we make sure that we have proper lubrication? Number one, always select the right grease. Don't use different greases. Don't mix greases, because greases have all these thickeners and mineral oils which are not meant, sometimes are not meant to be able to mix within each other. So always use the right grease. Always make sure that we grease the particular bearing based on the recommended interval and also the correct quantity. So these are all the questions, when it comes to greasing. So what is when I first install the bearing? So what's the first fill quantity? How much quantity is needed for my bearing? What grease is highly recommended? And the most important question is, when do I have to relubricate and at how much amount? So we are here to help you. All right. So if you can just take your phone, just scan on this particular QR code, and you'll be brought into this Scheffler Grease app. So when you're in there, all you have to do is to input certain information like the selection of your bearing part number, have your part number ready, understand what is the RPM and what is the load, whether if it's a high load, medium load, or low load. So this is based on your estimation. All right. And once you do that, a whole link of information, the recommended grease, the first fill quantity, if you're using automatic lubricators, what is the interval, and so on. So everything is there to help you out. So use this as a guide if you do not have any information on your lubrication for your particular machine, or if you do not have a manual as well. So you can use this as a guide. So please feel free to scan on this QR code and it will bring you to this Scheffler Grease app. It's really, really useful. I even use this as well, of course. All right. So next, there's a lot of information that we can gather from our website. So this is the Schaeffler Media's website. Click on it and you'll be brought into this particular page. So select your certain country. So now I'm in Malaysia, right? So what's next? So you'll be brought into this particular page. There's a whole lot of things that you can do over here. First and foremost, please register yourself, right? Just register this medias, right? And once you're in there, there's a whole lot of things. You can start off with this knowledge and support. And you can go to training. And there are trainings on products and even our lifetime solution systems. So if you go to products, so there are a whole lot of videos on different type of bearings. So you can have more information on what is a deep groove ball bearing, what is an angular contact ball bearing. So all these videos are all available in our media's website. And what are the properties and characteristics and so on. So this is where you can do your self-study when you're available and so on. So, but of course, again, feel free to contact us. Yeah. All right. So next thing, there's engineering tools. So there's bearing selection assistant. There's interchange. If you have a particular bearing from another brand, you would like to change it over to Scheffler or FAG bearing. So click onto the interchange, enter the part number. It will provide you the correct part number for our site. If you're using linear guide system, there's a linear configurator, bearing housings, heaters. For those who is doing condition monitoring, this is very important, where if you like to know what is our particular bearing frequency, you can actually use the bearing frequency calculator. So all of this information are in one website, which is basically in our Schaeffler Media's website. So if you register, then you'll be able to get more information, such as the knowledge and support on the trainings and etc. So all this is available. So please feel free to help yourself to register this in, and you can get a lot of knowledge from this particular website. All right. So let me go back to my slides. Here we go. So there's a very brief intro on our Schaeffler Medias. You can get the same type of information as, for example, the particular bearing, what is the load rating, what is the speed, what's the dimension, all you can get it from there as well. Okay, next we comes into maintenance. I mean, these are basically for maintenance teams. Normally, what will be your challenges, right? So the challenges, from what we understand as well, whether if you are plant maintenance team or even if you are plant manager, the biggest concern is always the unplanned downtime. And of course, it happens, whenever there is any bearing failure or any other failure that causes the bearing to fail. And of course, we have solutions for your challenges. This is where the Scheffler lifetime solutions comes in. We cover three main sectors here or topics here. Number one, we ensure that you have the proper lubrication. We monitor the bearings and mounting. So of course, the first thing about caring for your bearing is to make sure that you mount the particular bearing properly. So therefore, these are the three main things that Scheffler is able to offer so that you can extend the particular life of your bearing, and therefore you can reduce hugely on the unplanned downtime. All right, so now we come into the new age mounting. We call it MFD. In long words, it's called medium frequency technology. Also, just to share with you guys, mounting, basically there's three methods, right? So there's this thing called the mechanical method, where there's proper impact tools that you can use to mount smaller bearings. Generally, it's about 10 to 50 mm ball diameter. So you can use this type of impact mounting. Of course, this type of impact mounting, the sleeve here is made of aluminium, and there is this what do you call that, a plastic type of rings, that is unbreakable type, that actually absorbs this impact when we actually hit the bearings in. Right, so these are mainly for small type of bearings. And of course, some bearings uses torque as well to measure. And for bigger bearings, we use this type of method. We call it as the hydraulic method. So generally, hydraulic method is being used whenever there is this tapered kind of surface on the bearing ball. So what does this thing do? We actually hook up this hydraulic nut, right? Make sure that we have a pump available. And whenever we apply pressure to this particular hydraulic nut, it's going to push the bearing up. So when the bearing is actually pushed up, then it will actually grip onto the particular shaft, right? So these are meant for larger type of bearings. But the challenge happens when you have big bearings, yeah, and furthermore, it is not tapered ball. So how do we do that? So generally, people will use heating method. Heating method means that we heat up the bearing. There are many ways to heat up the bearing. You can use all bath. Traditionally, all bath, probably for big bearing, probably take you a few hours to heat up the particular bearing. Gas burners, right? Gas burners, yes, it heat up the bearing, but there are risks there, all right, to ensure that the bearings are expanded and so on. So the safe method here, generally we use this type of thermal method. So these are the induction heaters that actually heats up the bearing in a more controlled and a more uniform way to make sure that it doesn't affect, it doesn't have overheating that happens on the bearing. So furthermore, it heats up the bearing very uniformly. So of course, with a burner, one of the challenges is that you are not able to control the heating surface uniformly, right? So this is a traditional type. I mean, this is the one of the highly recommended type of induction heater to be used. But what if I were to tell you, if you have a huge bearing that there's no heater that can actually fit into any induction heater, right? So this is where the new technology comes in. We call it the MFD, medium frequency technology. So all you need is basically the generator and the flexible inductor. One tool to cover so many things. What are the things? Gear wheels. You can heat up the gear wheels. Of course, for bearings, no problem. You can heat up the housing. Some certain application, the housing are tight fit, where we have to expand the housing. So this is where we actually use this MFD to heat up the housing. Bearing inner rings, and doesn't stop there. Of course, there is couplings as well. So one tool covers so many applications. So just try to imagine how much time you can save, by not using all this traditional method, by heating with gas burners and so on. So this type of flexible inductors, number one, makes it super flexible to use it anywhere in any type of application. Let me show you an example. So traditionally, yes, people use this type of method, to heat up the particular inner ring. And look what happened. This is where uncontrolled temperature happens, right? So you have overheating on your bearing raceways. These are the bearing raceway that is very important because the rolling element actually runs on this particular surface. So to avoid that, this is where we actually use the MFD. So as you can see, we have a generator and we have the flexible inductor that wraps around the particular inner ring. So whenever this heat happens, of course, it's able to heat up very uniformly as well. And of course, if you have any certain parts like a spacer, that was stuck, and so on, we can actually use the MFD to heat up. So why do we heat up this particular steel area? So that it expands, and when it expands, then we are able to adjust the particular bearing accordingly. So the main purpose of the MFD is to heat up the particular part. All right. All right. So now we have covered the MFD portion. Now we go into the condition monitoring. So this is the product portfolio or the solution that we actually can offer from Scheffler. Number one is the scalable, one of the most simple system, not simple, but one of the most easily scalable system in our ecosystem, which is the OPTIME. This is a wireless sensor. It collects what But it collects 7 KPIs, like for example, the ISO, the demodulation, the acceleration, temperature, kurtosis, and so on. All these 7 KPIs are being captured every 4 hours. So you have a very good trending and so on. So it's being used, of course, in all type of application, heavy industry, in paper or in cement or etc. Highly recommended on fans and pumps and even motors as well. So this is a wireless sensor. It has a battery that lasts you actually up to about 5 years. So you can see how much savings you can do by installing wireless sensors because it doesn't require cable. And of course, when it comes to installation of this kind of sensors, one of the most important, one of the most expensive part is mainly on the wiring and the cabling. So next we have a higher end type of application, which is called the Smart Check and the ProLink CMS. So these two guys here are meant for for more critical equipment that requires constant or instant monitoring. So this is where this both system actually comes in, right? For large machines and so on. So we talk about this tree system, but is it able to link each other up? Yes, we call it as the Uptime Ecosystem. Number one is easy to start. Be it if you use a higher end version, which is the Smart Check or the ProLink, or if you use the Uptime, all of them is able to link into a certain area, which is our Schaeffler IoT Cloud. All right. So the Schaeffler IoT Cloud is able to support information from the higher end and even from the Uptime. So how does this work, right? So now imagine you have the Uptime wireless sensor installed at your machine. And you know what's the best part here? Is that Scheffler now is the only one that covers both things. It covers your vibration and it even covers your lubrication as well. So not only you know the condition of your machine, you also know what is the level of lubrication in your automatic lubricator that is installed at the particular machine. So when you look into your dashboard, you'll be able to see the condition for your machine and the level of the lubrication. So I guess we are basically the only one that actually does that, right? Wireless, both are wireless, is able to connect wirelessly into a gateway. And this is how the gateway looks like, right? It comes in a proper enclosure. Then data will be sent into our cloud. And from there, this is where you're able to access all this information anywhere you are. So this is all the KPIs as what I mentioned earlier for the Uptime. And the best part is after the machine learning from the Uptime is completed, you'll be able to have the list of probable costs that comes to you, whether if it's a bearing defect, it's a misalignment or cavitation, and etc. And also to share with you, we actually have the highest IP rating for our sensors, which is IP69K, right? Okay, so let me quickly go to the bearing defect. Of course, bearings are all installed inside your machine. It's very hard to open up and to have visual inspection. So normally the only way that we monitor the bearings is actually through vibration. So bearing fails in 3 stages, obviously, right? It starts off at very high frequency. And then when it comes to stage 3, this is where all the peaks happens. And this is where we can actually detect this kind of failures. So when we can detect at this area, it gives you months of period, you know, to plan for your shutdown, to buy your parts and etc. And of course, if you don't do anything, definitely the failure gets worse and worse and worse. And this is where when it comes to stage 4, then it is already way too late. So let me give you an example how data can actually help you to plan. So this is one example. This is with the Uptime system. Yeah, we install the Uptime over here. This is one of the pump, right? And then after certain measurement, it shows that there is a probable bearing damage or cavitation problem. So there's something wrong happening at this particular bearing. And if you look into the data, here we go. We install the sensors at the drive end and also the non-drive end. Let me quickly brief you on this information. Number one, what you see over here in the blue color lines here, this is actually the velocity. And the green color one is on the demodulation. And the lighter blue is on temperature. So if you look into the differences between these two, there's a spike happening over here at the pump non-drive side. which is what we showed in the picture earlier. So something is happening, it is above what is normal, right? And therefore the error message came out saying that it's a bearing defect and probably even cavitation. So we dig in depth, we look into the spectrum. Yes, there are some harmonics that is matching with the particular bearing defect frequency, and therefore we tell the customer, hey, the next shutdown is actually best that we actually remove the bearing. And when they did, this is what we found out, right? So there are slippage happening on this particular bearing. Why does this happen? They notice that the mechanical seal actually failed and the water basically seeped into the bearing, causing the grease to deteriorate. And when this happens, like what we mentioned earlier, whenever there's a grease breakdown, this is what will happen to the bearing, but this is at an early stage. All right, so other examples, this is taken with our Smart Check and ProLink. Again, trending. Every measurement, every day when there's measurement, this helps you to plan accordingly. So what we see here that the trend keeps on increasing, something is already wrong, right? But for this particular bearing, we notice that there is a failure happening on the outer race. And try to imagine the rollers passing by this spall area, then impacts will happen. We do not want to see impacts in bearing because this is due to failure on the surface, right? Other than that, for example, another case over here is from an e-motor. This was due to mishandling, right? And of course, from vibration, we detected from the frequency, and it shows that there's a failure at the inner ring. It pinpoints exactly where is it, whether it's an outer ring defect or even there's an inner ring defect. All right, I'll touch a little bit on gears as well. Of course, we don't only touch bearings, we gears as well. When it comes to vibration, it measures everything, right? So for this case, there's one case over here, we installed the sensors, right? It shows alarm on this particular area. And of course, why does this happen? If you notice on the gear teeth, the surface on this area looks fine, and there's very heavy wear on only one side. And what does this tell you? There's a misaligned gear. And vibration itself is already telling the customer, hey, you actually have very big problem happening because all of these measurements are exceeding the level. And if we look into the spectrum for in-depth analysis, so what you see here, this peak and this peak, right? This is the gear mesh frequency. So the one-time gear mesh frequency is lower, second one is higher. And if you look back into any vibration fault chart, see here the gear mesh one time is low and the second time is high, gear misaligned. Gear misaligned is already shown in this particular data, and of course if nothing is done, then bad failure will actually happen to the gearbox, like what we see earlier, damage on the shaft. All right, few more slides. Basically misalignment, right? Of course, based on data as well, these are taken every day, 6 measurements a day. So any high increase will actually tell you something. Of course, the Uptime Ecosystem indicates, pinpoint to you that this is due to misalignment, probably bearing defect as well, and so on. And this is where you can actually plan your shutdown and replace the certain part or do the alignment accordingly. Right? So this is actually what happens to the particular pump. Based on spectrum, we do in-depth analysis. There's a 2-time over here, right? This is a 1-time, the 2-time. So there are 2-time dominant over here, and this is where it indicates misalignment. Okay, lastly, one key takeaway here. So why Scheffler? Well, we actually have the technical know-how from bearings to lubrication to mounting to condition monitoring. So we are basically all in one, right? Friendly, yes, please call us up, right? Friendly, competent customer service, and we make things very easy for everyone, for the end users. I mean, look at Optime, is just plug, play, and predict. We make it super easy for installation and even for scaling as well later on. All right, that's basically all from my end. Back to you, Sean. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Henry, for your presentation. And also, we'd like to invite everyone to go ahead and leave their questions in the comment section if you have anything for our guest speaker today. Now, Mr. Henry, I do have some questions for you, beginning with number one. What's generally the first thing I should do in order to ensure that my bearings or my machine runs smoothly? What tips do you have for me?
All right, that's a very interesting question, a very good question as well. I think when it comes to ensuring the whole system works fine, it begins with buying genuine bearing. Getting genuine bearing from the authorized distributor is the most important thing, because there's a lot of counterfeit bearings that is coming in as well. I think this the counterfeit bearing can somehow looks very similar. That's the reason why in our packaging, there is this QR code, and you can use your phone, be it Apple or Android, install this app called the Origin Check by Scheffler. So you can scan this particular QR code with our app, and this is where you can ensure that you have the genuine bearing. So number one, very important, genuine bearing. If you get fake bearings, then it's very high risk that you have very early failure happening. Okay, and what's next? When you get genuine bearing, the next thing is on the storage, right? So keep the bearings in the proper storage. Don't throw the bearing around and so on. Any mishandling will cause the bearing to fail even before it's even being mounted. What else? Make sure the part number is correct. If the bearing comes with C3 or it comes with seal, order back the same one. So make sure you have the same bearing for that particular application. Furthermore, mounting. Prior to mounting, always measure the shaft and the housing tolerances, because if there's anything that's out of tolerances, failure will tend to happen. Next is to mount the bearing properly, and also last but not least is to lubricate the bearing properly. So when you have all these steps in line, this is actually where you can actually improve your machine life cycle. Yeah.
Okay, so it's a combination of three major things then, making sure you have genuine products installed.
Yep.
Making sure you have the right measurements and tolerances.
Yep.
And lubrication, right?
Definitely.
So that's right. A very comprehensive answer. Now, going back to some of the slides, the pictures you shared with the different methods of bearing installation, right? And one of the concerns is I've been using my induction heater to mount my bearings. And what would be the benefit of the MFT itself, the MFT process?
All right, sure. If we look into the induction heater, like for example, this one, right? It is mainly used for mounting, and it depends on the size of the heaters. There's some limitation on the on how you want to place the particular part. So if you only use this on bearings, then it's fine. There's no problem. But in a particular plant, there's more than that. You know, there are couplings. There are huge bearings. There may be gear wheels. So you can use basically such system or such in the such tools like the MFD for mostly everything. So for the MFD, it covers a wider range of area rather than just bearings.
I see. And so going back to the question about installation, there's three main methods. I saw you cycle through the slides there. So when should I use certain types of methods? For example, how would I know?
All right. So I mean, again, we have these three types. I mean, not we, but in the industry, there's basically these three type of method. Start with mechanical, hydraulic, and thermal. So of course, for smaller bearings, you know, if we talk about very small bearings, this is where we can actually use the mechanical method, but of course with the right tool, right? Don't use any steel piping and hit onto the bearing. That's going to cause failure as well. So smaller bearings, like for example, 10 mm diameter up to about 50 mm diameter, yes, this is something that we can actually use such mechanical, the right impact tool. Larger bearings, however, with tapered ball, right? So straight ball means that the inner ring here is actually straight. So with tapered ball, you can see that it's actually tapered. So the only way for tapered ball to be installed is normally to push the particular bearing up, right? So this is where the hydraulic nut comes in, right? We apply oil, then there'll be pressure, and this particular piston will actually push the bearing up. So we cannot use heater for such application. The only way is basically with hydraulic method. Of course, with thermal, it covers a bit more wider range. Of course, mainly with the cylindrical bore type, the straight type, right? Is for different sizes. I mean, you have small sizes of bearings. If you don't choose to use mechanical, you can always use thermal as well. There's no problem. So the heater comes in various sizes, from heater 20, which is able to cater up to about 20 kg bearing part, or up to even about 1,600 kg and so on. So they are big and small ones as well.
So a lot of installation definitely depends on the size of it to begin with.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah, all right. Okay, well, thank you for that. Now, also in a later set of slides, you were talking about how to detect failures with the bearings themselves. And you said that one of the key indicators actually vibration monitoring, right?
Yep.
So, and if I'm not mistaken, these monitoring systems are oftentimes online, and they can be viewed remotely, or maybe through a cloud-based system, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And so with online systems, there is a risk of cybersecurity attacks or vulnerabilities with cybersecurity. So what sort of advice do you have for someone that may be concerned with these sort of attacks?
Okay, very interesting question. Thank you so much. All right. Of course, when we talk about everything going to the cloud, I think some of the companies, do not favor this. But be rest assured that our Scheffler IoT or with our Scheffler Cloud actually uses a very famous platform, which is MS Azure. So of course, if you trust your emails with Microsoft, this information is also going into MS Azure platform. And also to further elaborate that as well, of course, if we look into this kind of sensors, right, it measures your vibration, but it doesn't gather any other information. Like for example, your production capability, or your production downtime and so on. So all this kind of system, they do not capture sensitive information. So it is purely on the vibration that this sensor measures. So therefore, there is no high, perhaps, I mean, my understanding, there's no really P&C information that actually goes into the system, that goes into the cloud. So yeah.
Okay, so yeah, that would that's definitely very sort of comforting to know that only the vibration information is being relayed and interpreted, perhaps. And yeah, I think there might be some concerns about that, but since it's only vibration data, then I think that's pretty much okay at the end of the day. All right, so Mr. Henry, thank you very much for answering all those questions and doing so very comprehensively. It's appreciated. And also thank you very much for your presentation today. I think all of us have learned a lot about bearing technologies, about the methods of installation and mounting it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to all of our viewers and to the audience, please do leave some comments into our Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube channels, and with a quick thank you message to our guest speaker, Mr. Henry, today. We also would really love to hear from you and be delighted to see your support on our social media portals. So now, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to an end to our webinar, and we would like to request once again for all of you to leave a quick like, follow, and subscribe on our Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube channels. And don't forget to check out our IK community page, iClub by IK on Facebook. And they'll give you all of our latest updates for upcoming live webinar series, such as this one, and also other upcoming future events. Please check your emails as well for a thank you email from our team at IK. It's going to be done through Eventbrite, and that link will give you a barcode to receive your e-certificate. So don't forget to claim it within 3 days. Once again, on behalf of IK Academy, we would like to thank Mr. Henry for his presentation and being here today. And that's it from me. This is Sean from IK Academy signing out. Goodbye, everyone.